I'm here today with Lauren Skelly Bailey. Um,
Hi.
there she is, right? You can still see her. Right?
Okay.
Lauren is a younger sculptor working in ceramics, and um, it's almost like everything that Lauren does in sculpture is stuff that you think you shouldn't do, and she makes absolutely beautiful work. Right? So, Lauren, why don't you show us or tell us a little bit of, well, that's about what you're doing now. Let's see what you're doing now. Let's start with that if you can get to that.
Okay.
There you go. There's a now.
So right now, this is probably the least amount of surface that's been like aggressively put together. But my studio practice is in clay, and I'm kind of using a variety of methods to make coil-based forms and wheel-thrown forms and mold-made, and kind of reassembling them based off of ideas and structures that I've seen in nature, as well as just like overall decorative arts. So this piece was actually the first piece I made coming back to the studio. I was kind of on hiatus for a few months after having my daughter, and I guess I kind of felt like I was on this like iceberg of ideas.
So that
And
would have been about a year ago, right?
yeah, just about a year ago.
Mhm.
So I wasn't making work for like the first 6 months because I was like breastfeeding and like figuring out how to be a mom and all that jazz, and it was just a lot to juggle. I think I just felt like so overwhelmed. And then coming back to clay was like not really stressful. It's just kind of like when you're so in love with your material and you take a break and you come back, I feel like it kind of gives you a chance to look at things differently. And I wanted to see a surface that didn't have like so much going on. So this piece is probably
So
about,
this is minimal for you then.
this is minimal for me. And there's like one little coral sticking out of the end on the bottom left there. And then I was also thinking about my pedestal and that becoming a part of the piece, and kind of having that conversation about a form being kind of uplifted and not just on the floor or like on like a solid item. But I wanted to play with that. I've also been looking at like Arlene Sheckett's work, and I really admire how she's able to kind of make the whole piece, including the pedestal, a part of the piece. Nicole Cherubini does like a similar thing where she also sometimes uses her own pots, I guess, as the base, or to make like these totems of surface, and the whole piece and the platform that it sits on is also a part of that conversation.
So a lot of your pieces are built of sections, right? That build up
Yeah,
sometimes and sometimes out, right?
yeah, it depends. Usually it's like 2 to 200 plus items that are then hand stacked to create a piece if I'm doing an installation, or like right now, sorry, I have to go back. I have these forms like this couple here, I'm calling them Rendezvous, they're new.
Oh, they're
On the
beautiful. Yeah.
left hand side, the white and blue form on the top is separate from that base piece, and then on the right the other piece is completely glaze adhered. So I'm kind of stuck with some sizing because of the kiln that I have, and that only being about 2 to 3 feet deep. So that's as tall as I can get before I'd have to create a separate piece.
So before we talk about these, I wanted to share with you a story from my graduate school, and it's about a mother who came to talk to the graduate students, right? And I was at Hunter College, and there was this thing about art having to be the primary thing in your life. And then this woman showed up. Her name was Valerie Jordan, a painter. And she talked about moving to New York. And after she moved to New York, she had a child. And then all of a sudden, she had to alter the way that she was doing her art because, well, you have to be a parent before anything else if you choose to be a parent, right? That's a great responsibility. And at that very time, I was a young parent. My son was just about a year old, and he had suffered through a severe illness in his even earlier than that. So for me, like making art was important, and I never stopped. But like you know, parenthood is really important. I just wanted to throw that in there before we went back to talking
Yeah,
about your
no,
work.
Francesca D'Amato, who does really incredible ceramic work and like on a very large scale and has a studio up in Hudson. She's been really open about having her second child, and she often documents herself making her work and then also being with her baby. And she kind of allows her older son to also be involved in the studio process. And I found that kind of really inspirational, that like the art doesn't have to stop because like you're a parent, but kind of finding a way to like make those like ebbs and flows of life like join in with your practice. And I have Eve come in here a handful of times with you know, like with one of my parents to take a look at the studio, and sometimes that even kind of helps me to focus on like things that maybe I haven't been thinking about. I have a lot of work in here that's like at various stages, and sometimes I kind of bounce back and forth between things, but I've been kind of like every few weeks bringing Eve in with me and seeing what she's drawn to, and then like maybe working on that a bit more. This piece here is like really big for me color wise, and I think it has a lot to do with like being around all these bright colors with a small child all the time.
Yes.
And the piece on the left, like as much as I'm kind of pulling away from some of my roots being in nature, I'm still kind of playing with the ideas about like that base piece on the left. There was like an underpainting that I had painted on top of glazes during my process that I then fired against to kind of allow that to kind of shift, kind of like life.
So when I look at these pieces, you know, I see that on the left you added almost like a lid to a vessel, right, to that piece. But the construction of the pieces seems to be made of lots of little parts that are put together.
Yeah, so the top blue section's actually it's a thrown vessel upside down that then I had adhered this like coral floral texture that I've come up with in my practice on top of, and then I was doing like a blue and white kind of, I guess, cameo or underpainting on top of those forms that were then glazed. And I was trying to repeat a similar idea of that blue and white on the base piece.
So those what you call the coral floral forms here, they are almost paper thin, aren't they?
Yeah. When I was at Adelphi as a studio manager, I had like kind of a gap year between Adelphi and grad school. And like I got my MA during that year because I'd taken so many extra credits that I was like 40 shy of an MA, and they like needed a studio manager and I needed a studio. So it was kind of like, it was kismet, like, you know, it was meant to be, I felt. I had to make clay for them, and they reclaim their clay. Most schools do. So the extra scrappings get put into a machine with extra powdered clay, maybe some other oxides like red art and water, and it gets mixed, and then it pops out these little loaves of clay. But at the bottom, you end up with like this like weird sludge that there's not much you can do with, and like you wouldn't throw it out because you wouldn't waste it. But you can't necessarily, like, it would take way too much powder mix to like make into new clay. So they kind of like leave it there. And I had taken that as an opportunity to like figure out a way to reformat it. And they had these huge plaster tables at Adelphi, and I laid out all this thin slip, and I kept layering it out in sheets and sheets and sheets until it built up. And the plaster soaks up that moisture from the clay. So you ended up with these really thin, beautiful sheets. And I was using spacklers to pull up these like paper thin forms.
They're almost like pencil shavings.
Yeah, just huge.
Yeah, but huge, yeah.
Almost like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, but like actually. So when I was at Adelphi, I was making rosettes with them at one point, and I didn't really think much of it. And in grad school, I made a piece, and someone told me that it looked like a derby hat, and I got offended. So I like taught myself to hand build, since I didn't hand build at Adelphi. And I kind of came up with all these alternative ways of like making things.
So all the while you were at Adelphi, you didn't hand build?
I actually skipped a lot of things. I don't know if they didn't realize it or not, but Auntie Lou found out I could throw during my freshman year. I had gone to Adelphi to become a painter, and I never took a painting class, unless it was like required of me. But they found out I could throw, and they invited me to a barbecue, because they used to barbecue with the pit outside and have like Korean barbecue and raku at night on Wednesdays. It was like the big deal. And I got invited to go as a freshman in my second semester. And I met Bill, and Bill was like, "So you're going to take my class in the summer?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, like when's your class?" He's like, "No, like you're registered for it, like you're taking it." And I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah.
That
So
would be Bill Shillelgh's.
yeah,
Bill is a
yeah,
friend of the Patrick Arts Council, and every year Bill does the Raku Party as a fundraiser for the Arts Council, and it's a lot of fun. The work is this is his work on the right now. The
really known for
Raku
that weird
process.
kind of glaze.
Do you want to share what a Raku process is, or would you like for me to do that?
Sure. Raku's kind of it's a glaze firing that happens all at once, and you get the product within like basically 2 hours. But you glaze the piece, it goes into a kiln outside, that's then ignited with a with gas as a gas firing outdoors, and then they lower the lid and you wait like 45 minutes till it gets to, is it 19?
Close to 2,000 degrees. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. And Bill will open the kiln, and you use these wire tongs that are extremely long, and you wear shoes, and your hair is tied back because you don't let yourself on fire. Very important. And everyone takes their turn to remove their pot from this kiln to put it in wood shavings, and they cover it with another metal bucket. And you wait, and you allow the oxygen that's within there to be like you're reduced firing it basically because you're covering it and allowing for like a changing of temperature. And this piece that is basically on fire at that point, you wait like 15 minutes, you hose it down, and you wait a little bit longer so that you're not touching an exceedingly hot piece. And you get these kind of really beautiful, in some cases black and white crackling because the oxygen's infiltrated the cracking of that glaze that makes like this, it's not crackling like Bill's piece here, it's more of a surface, almost like a charcoal drawing. Or some pieces have like an oil spill to them that are, it's pretty sexy.
Right.
So it just like depends on like what you're going for. These glazes do different things, but you get the piece like basically right after firing it because you know you can do it this outdoor firing. It's just if you do other glazes, it usually takes like a few days.
Right. So we do this as a fundraiser, and when you come, Bill Shillelgh's will have thrown a whole 70 or so bowls, and you
Beautiful
glaze
people.
them yourself, and then you get to do the raku process, which is they get put into the kiln. The kiln gets raised to 2,000 degrees. Maybe over the course of 40 minutes or so, the temperature goes up, and then you take them right out as they're 2,000 degrees, right?
Yeah.
And you put them into this bed of flammable stuff, right? And then you snuff out. It starts to burn. It's a lot of fun. It starts to burn.
It's an experience, and Bill's definitely about the experience of clay.
Yes, right.
Like having him as a mentor was always great because it was never like, how could I do this? It was like, just do it. You'll figure it out. And as much as you're like, wait, what? And but ceramics is something that you need to do and you need to keep practicing. And if you need to redo it, you'll figure it out how to redo it. The piece on the left is from Auntie Lou. He was another one of my mentors while I was at Adelphi. He made more comical art. As you can see, there's urinals on a, army cargo unit. And he was kind of like, go big or go home. So it was kind of an interesting ceramics family to become a part of. I know Barbara Rocco was there at the same time, as well as Roseanne Ebner, and they've been really kind of influential female artists that I was working with at the time too. Roxanne, I think now is at Brick House, and she's shown at a few different places as well. And her work's definitely grown from kind of smaller forms about the body up to these huge, fountains.
Right, she was making those great pieces that were part figure and part architecture, back then. So we've shown both Roseanne and Barbara at the Patrick Arts Council in the past. Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of got hooked onto like textures at Adelphi while I was there.
I love this
always
piece.
have to try all the things out. And this is the big thing at Adelphi at the time was like this wood fire kiln, which is in the back on the left-hand side. That thing that looks like it's on fire is on fire. It's a wood fire kiln. It's one chamber. And it was like this huge gathering that happened at Adelphi. Everyone would make pots. Everyone would help load the kiln and brick up the front. And we all took like 6 to 12 hour shifts to stoke the kiln.
Takes
or
about 2 days.
7 days.
Yeah, 7. Yeah, that long.
I think we
Takes
were
a
able
long
to get it up to cone 10 in like 4 days, and that was like a big deal at one point. But it's basically like a huge potluck, and that's Auntie warming his hands in front of the fire. And then on your right-hand side is some of my work that came out of that wood firing. We didn't glaze. Some people do glaze. I know Chris Gustin glazes his work. Everybody's different with like how they load their wood fire kilns and like what they do. But basically, in order to get these beautiful colors that we're getting, it depends on like what oxides we're putting in our clay. So I know that at that time we were putting red art and I think maybe gold art and some other oxides into our clay to get those irons out. And then the blue, depending on where the work is in the kiln, you get all these different colors. So at the end of it, it kind of reminds me of, as cheesy as it sounds, the end of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, where they're all singing around the tree. That kind of line of people is what happens to unload one of these kilns. It takes like an army to unload it. Everyone is so happy to see everybody's experience in all their work, and it's kind of nice because you get to share the success of the firing with everyone who's involved. And it's like it was such a great community aspect for us over there. I think we fired like 2 or 3 times a year. I think my favorite was like near Thanksgiving because everyone got everybody's leftovers. But so I was kind of exploring work at that time, like functionally, and kind of getting into like a warped. Oopsies. Where did it go?
So while you're figuring that out, I also fired in those anagamic firings as well. And one of the things that would happen in those firings is that just all of the like whatever residual metals were in the wood would like burn out and fill the atmosphere and coat the clay, so you could get these kind of metallic sheens on your pieces.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I had no idea necessarily like what you get. Some people would put like fat flashing slips on the work, so it would be like a slip that was mixed with specific oxides to do something different, like flashes of white or red or orange would come up.
Yeah, so when you have an oxide and you put it in the clay, think of like the most familiar oxide is rust, iron oxide, right? And when you reduce it, you remove the oxygen from it. Or is it when you oxidize it, you remove the oxygen from it, and it goes from rust to looking like... Yeah. You know, the two different states of iron, one being the rust and the other being the metal, right? So you can move back and forth between those in the firings. Okay, what do we have here?
This was a soda-fired piece from Adelphi. So that it was funny because like we were doing a heavy reduction, and I didn't think I'd get that greenish blue that's on the bottom there, because normally that kind of a color would turn red, and it didn't. So for a while, everyone was curious like why that happened, and I don't know if we figured it out or not. But I think it may have just been where it was placed in the kiln. It may have been somewhere that didn't get as reduced as some of the other pieces.
So looking at this piece, you know, I'm seeing like this colony of mollusks, if you don't mind me saying so.
You're fine.
You know, and it looks like they're all gathered together, and you know, they're like especially like in the lower center of it, you see those slug-like shapes that are formed in there, and yeah, so you know, I'm seeing in this piece things that you would evolve into your work, into your later work.
Right. And then senior year we had like a show, and I didn't know what I wanted to show, and they weren't thrilled with the idea of me throwing in the gallery, so like naturally I had to break that rule. So I had Auntie help me with the truck, bring a wheel into the gallery, and we taped up plastic, and I threw in the gallery for about 6 straight hours making this piece. So the whole piece was put on this pedestal wet, and then over the course of 2 weeks, like parts of it fell, and I kind of like let it be, because at that time I was really interested in being like so involved with the clay. Like I mixed or reclaimed all of this clay. I wanted the work to kind of be like this cyclical like ocean environment, and I wanted it to then also be recycled afterwards. So I took care of reclaiming it, and parts of this ended up being fired and glazed as kind of like an idea, like the idea of like an artifact of a process. I have a zoom? I don't.
Or a fossil even.
Yeah, definitely. So, and then unfortunately, during the time that this piece was up, someone had planted plants in their thesis piece, and praying mantis ended up hatching in the gallery, and we had to like remove them carefully. I was also working at the gallery at the time, and I felt bad because some of them kind of just got stuck to my piece.
So MFA shows are notorious for, senior shows are notorious for students stretching out, and sometimes the unexpected happens, huh?
Yeah. So this was like the last piece. Well, one of the last pieces I made at Adelphi. I didn't put some grad work in because I felt like that was really transitional, and it was more of this kind of work. But when I went to grad school, one of my studio mates was Soyu Nue. She's on the left there. She's from Myanmar. She had a lot of really interesting insights into building these kind of, I guess, aggressive floral forms that often relate to the body. And then on the right is Larry Bush, who is one of my mentors at RISD. And unfortunately, he passed just about a year ago. But he was a functional potter, but he always kind of helped me push the envelope. And he always thought like my work looked really good on a tabletop. And we'd have the conversation about how like it was still technically functional. He also often liked to paint flowers on his pots, but I couldn't find the image that I was looking for. It was actually a wood-fired piece that he had painted, I think with acrylics. And that felt like such a like rule-breaking thing ceramic-wise for me. Because I feel like wood-fired surfaces should be kept untouched, but I've been breaking that rule myself lately.
So with the wood fire, does the clay go beyond bisque? Does it go to?
Yeah, so it's for the wood firing, all the work would be bisque fired, and then it would be wadded, which is a mix of sodium silicate with something else. I'm missing it. My bad. I haven't fired in a while. But you mix basically like almost like kiln wash to the extent of like a gummy texture, and you would glue that on the bottom of a piece, and then you stack everything, not lid to lid, so that they don't shatter when you undo it, because it's completely tumble stacked inside the kiln. On shelves, but like tumble stack, which is like kind of chaotic and crazy.
That's when you pile up all of the pieces on top of each other. You
make sure that it's done in a certain way so that when you go to deconstruct it, that you're not gonna like have like a pile come down at you or like
a Jenga.
Yeah, it's real life Jenga. Yeah. And I took a break from that for a little bit. I think at RISD, like we didn't always have the option to wood fire. Larry actually built a wood fire kiln out of an old cargo unit at the Steel Yard, which is a residency and art program in Providence. And they do a lot of giving back to their community as well. And then I took Glaze Chemistry with Frank Bosco, whose piece is on the left there. He runs the New Jersey Academy of Ceramics in New Jersey. And that's one of his slip cast pieces that he used.
So you weren't in Jersey City though. He was
teaching at RISD at the time for Glaze Chem. And a lot of the things that I learned in his class are gonna kind of come up in my beginning work. Katrina Radaman was like one of my studio mates my first year, and she ended up transferring out of RISD, but she made really interesting installation work, and I think she helped me to kind of think about my work differently.
Before you go on, I just wanted to go back and talk about glaze chemistry for a second, because not everybody who's here might be as familiar with the ceramic processes.
Right.
So glazes, right, are a whole bunch of different compounds that you mix together, and they'll have different results by the processes of mixing together these different compounds, and you can get glazes that are, all sorts of different effects from the glazes. The coloration, of course, is different, but the textures that you can get out of the glazes are all based on the reaction of the chemicals. So a ceramist needs to be aware of a lot of chemistry, and a lot of it is, trial and error chemistry to see the effects they want on it.
Right, and so for Frank's class, we had to make these trays here. And everything went into a tray so that if something happened in the kiln that was unsavory, it didn't ruin the kiln. I was not always great with that, but it did work in my favor most of the time. So like this piece here is actually made up underglazes and clay bodies that I found in the sinks at school. They had all these like clay containers that would kind of like gather all the clay in the sink so that you didn't stock up the clay, you know, in the pipes. And at one point I was collecting all that stuff, and then I was repacking it with more ceramic material. So like this here is more of like a green oxide, like chrome oxide with like a manganese dioxide, which is like really not great for you. And then this bit here was actually really low fire clay that I had tucked in there. And the top of this is gold. So this went on, like, this was a few firings later and was the last firing to be done. But I thought this looked like a hot butter running down this like weird, crazy erosion of things when I started making these like rock forms in grad school. But so I kind of had to like learn how to make all these different bits that then would fire. And then I was really intrigued by how different firing temperatures affected these materials, because in the beginning when you fired it, it would come out and it just looked like a bunch of rocks. And then I packed more glaze, which is a mixture of flux, a colorant, a clay base, and sometimes some other oxides to help with that melting process. So I didn't think to document all the different ones. And now that I'm firing more times, I am documenting more often. But these pieces were, I took that knowledge that I learned from glaze chemistry and then packed clay materials with some of these glazes and other colorants and clay bodies, so that as I fired these pieces, different things would kind of flow out of the form. The glaze on the right is like was a glaze that I accidentally kind of like fudged up at Adelphi, and I took it with me because like they were just going to pitch it. And I had permission to take it with me. But I found out at Cone 10 it was this beautiful blue. And I remember feeling like so relieved that like it did have a good outcome. I ended up putting like too much of an oxide in it that I wasn't supposed to, because it was mislabeled in the back.
So these pieces, you know, you put the glaze in them,
yeah,
and then the heat kind of
reacted
makes it flow and flux and move, and it's almost like it sounds like it's volcanic,
right.
where these things seep out of the. What's that?
Like creating my own phenomenon, if you will.
Yeah. It's like
this one over here. Like this is, I didn't realize I had inherited clay discs from an older grad, and I didn't think to ask if her porcelain was like high fire or not, and that was my mistake. So there was a tray underneath this thing, you could see it there, and I was like, oh, this will be great. I could put this like porcelain on top, and it wasn't even porcelain. It was like a low fire stoneware, which is still beautiful, but it happened to melt on the shelf. And I remember opening the kiln and being like, oh God, like, what am I gonna do? And I had luckily washed my shelf, which is this like white paste that you put on your kiln shelf, so that if anything does happen, you can just chip it off. And this piece came off the shelf beautifully. Like not an inch of this was left on the shelf. But
so when the glazes are liquid, they sometimes run, and they run down the piece, and sometimes they're on trays because they'll run down the piece right onto the shelf, and then they'll fuse with the shelf.
Yeah, and then you have really fun conversations with people about, you know, how to take it off the shelf, or sometimes people leave it on the shelf and like they don't realize that they need to remove it. But so like, you know, you can see these other glazes and forms that started to kind of puff up, or kind of this pink here is actually Speedball's underglaze peach. It kind of creates this beautiful bubbly texture, and these are things that people wouldn't want on like a functional surface most of the time. And I love these because I kind of learned how to harness them and use them in ways that would benefit me. So then I started playing with underglazes and layering those with glazes, and like kind of taking this study of an object further. This is actually wax that I had melted onto the piece. I thought that was kind of a fun juxtaposition of like a really matte, you know, foggy thing next to something really shiny and like semi-obnoxious. And later I started bringing mold-made forms and wheel-thrown forms into these like slabs of uncertainty, you know, materials. And I'm playing with like layering of underglazes with glazes, and kind of like really just like, I think I called it like had a word for it. It was great. And it's now leaving my mind, but I kind of repacked all these materials onto clay and kind of watched them change over time. This piece was added later, I'll admit that. And then I think things got like really overwhelmingly mushy at one point, and I needed to kind of step back and kind of find something simple. So I took impressions of my radiator, and that's what this is here. And I put a palladium glaze, which would look like a mirror-like surface. And I was kind of playing with putting this more delicate thing on top of a rock that I painted with acrylic. And I think after making some of those kind of choices, I kind of found myself back at making the rocks, but then it was more intentional with where I was putting those glazes and things to get these kind of crazy surfaces. And then the corals kind of came back into it there and here. And
it's a great piece. Yeah, it's
yeah. And then the corals became the thing that I was interested in. And I was building these coral beds. This is about 5 by 7 feet. This was in my studio in grad school. And I just became really interested in building up the surface and creating an environment in a space that people could be, you know, looking over precariously. Everything was like hand stacked. And the uneasiness that I created in my studio space amongst like, I don't know, like the 10 people that were in there, I thought was great, you know, because people were really cautious walking around it. And, you know, it's kind of sometimes hard to make people feel uneasy around something so fragile and so like pretty, you know, pretty art could be nerve-wracking. I didn't think that was a thing. The sheets that are underneath these forms, like these guys here, are actually rolled out porcelain on top of plaster blocks that I carved to get the impression to create the print. So, and then after grad school, I came home and had a studio, and I applied for a show with this piece. And I ended up getting the Best in Show Award at the Clay Arts Center for New York Tri-State of Mind. And I got a phone call asking if I could put together enough work for a solo show within like 3 months. And I said, sure. And I had half of the space, not even, I think I had a quarter of the space that I have now. And I got myself a kiln, and I lucked out and got the space reorganized, and I like pumped out all this like brand new work using all the things that I had learned over a long period of time. And like I brought back, these were actually made in undergrad, and I had kind of rediscovered them and kind of went back in and put flock on them. I thought that like surface would be such a great like comment on clay, you know, like versus being really rough and soft. And I brought the corals back, but then I started painting the sheets before I pulled them up because I liked creating these like funny little patterns that then like no one had any idea it was a pattern by the time I pulled it up. And I started including some acrylic in the work, which felt like rule breaking to me, although it's really not in my realm. So the hot pink on here is also flock. I went to Vermont Studio Center after grad school, and someone had got me into flock. So this is Devin. She got me into flock. Someone had
just to clarify that, what flocks is that stuff that when you get a Valentine's card and it has that soft surface on it, it's these tiny particles that you glue and you kind of flow onto the surface.
Yeah, it's another thing that can kill you, so you have to wear a respirator. If you also think about like kind of like the trippy wallpaper with the black velvet, I always think of that. The Museum of the City of New York has this like room that was like I guess funded by Tiffany's. And it's got like deep purple with like practically purple black silk screen flowers that are flocked onto the wall. I think it's on like the second floor. And I always thought that was like the coolest thing ever. And I never understood how they got it on the wall for some reason, because I realized they obviously made it in sheets. But Devin had gotten her hands on some flock from another resident artist, and she flocked everything in her studio. This is not a picture of that. Couldn't find a picture of that. Otherwise I would have used it. But she had flocked fake grapes. And I always thought that was like such a funny comment. And then she'd like leave these things around campus for people to find. And I think for at one point someone thought it was like moss that had overgrown on an item, but that was not the case. So I brought flock back into my work, and I enjoyed the vibrancy of it and the surface variation. I'm sure, John, when you're working between stone and wood, you kind of find like a likeness to the surfaces that you can create from the different materials.
Yeah, yeah. I guess lately the thing I've been most interested in is like I've almost given up on any rougher texture, and I've gotten lost in the smoothness of the wood. So it almost has a translucent feel when it gets really, really polished, and you can see into the grain of it. But I mean, that's one surface, and these are some other amazing surfaces here that you make.
Yeah. I mean, they're all different, but I think I took a stone carving class with John during my like gap year at Adelphi, and I remember that I don't know if I ever thought I had to work so hard with a piece of rock in my life. But I wish I had kept all the dust we had created with the alabaster to make a glaze. That was like my only regret in that class.
I could give you plenty of it.
You had mentioned about like allowing materials to do what they can do best, and like not trying to necessarily replicate that in another form if it wasn't working. And I felt like that was something that's like stuck with me even now. So like I knew I couldn't make flock in clay. You know, you can make a surface that looks like flock, but does it feel like flock? Like it's never gonna feel that soft and kind of like luxurious. So, you know, sometimes I feel like if that's the reason why I'm replacing something with something not clay in my practice, that I'm okay with it because I'm allowing another material to do what it can do best.
Right. Good idea.
So, yeah.
There are the ceramists who feel like the material is sacrosanct, and then there's artists like Lauren who work with ceramics but are not limited to ceramic.
I mean, I'm definitely more like, I don't know, I feel like it's still breaking rules to use something that's not ceramic in my practice, and I'm totally just like, I'm really in like the shallow end of that. There's people like Arlene Sheckett or like, you know, Nicole Cherubini or, you know, Ling Chung or other people that are using so many other things in their practices. So like for me right now, that's something I'm like kind of exploring on the side. But I'm trying to do that more lately because I feel like it's kind of a gravitational pull.
Have you ever seen the work of Toby Bonagorio? She was my professor.
Oh, nice.
And we were like diametrically opposed, as I was like the most organic person I could be back then. And I used to call her the queen of the low fire, but she was flocking her work too.
Yeah, she has those beautiful pieces in one of the train stations in Manhattan that are encased in these like little windows.
Right. That's Grand Central Station.
Like kind of robotic looking, almost balloon animal looking, like the way that they're formed looks similar to that.
She had gone to Japan.
The metallic colors, the luster is like, she's a force. I met her once at another symposium in the city. And I was like, oh, we're at Stony Brook.
She had gone to Japan in the early 70s, and she had, like, before anybody in the United States knew anything about like Japanese anime or anything like that, she was making these robots based on Japanese animation. Right? And there was like nobody around who knew what they were. And then a couple of years later, it's like, oh, that's what that is.
Yeah, but her color choices are brilliant. I really like admire that about her work. But
well, this piece on the left is amazing here. You know, it looks, you know, it doesn't look like you could have made it. It looks like it had to grow.
That's what I kind of liked about it. And I felt like I was really using that knowledge that I learned in Glaze Chem because I kind of got all these different things to do different things that I wanted. The pink here is actually a rare earth metal called erbium, or erbium, yeah, something like that. Anyway, I got in trouble coming back from NCECO with like 2 pounds of it in my carry-on because I totally forgot to put it in not my carry-on. So I almost didn't get it through security, but then they like kind of realized there's like 5,000 people coming from a clay convention and that like I wasn't doing anything crazy with it other than sticking it in a kiln. So like I lucked out. And then in between these two pieces, I took a workshop with Brian Kinzinski at Peters Valley, which is a craft school in northern Jersey. which if you ever had the chance to go, assuming that things, you know, can kind of go back to normal in a way that you can go somewhere and experience making things in a different place, I highly recommend Peters Valley. I've gone many times. Bill introduced me to them because he knows the director there. And it was always just a lot of fun. They have like 3 wood fire kilns. So if you're looking for that kind of experience, they have it. But Brian was teaching us how to build 3D printers that extruded clay. So the base of this piece is actually extruded porcelain, blue porcelain.
Nice.
I had put one of my reclaim rocks on top. And then I had this piece was a pine cone that I did a burnout of. A burnout's when you take organic material and you dip it in clay slip and you fire it at a low temperature. The organic form fires out, but you end up with like kind of what I consider a time capsule or a memory of an item that may not look exactly like as that item was, but is kind of reminiscent of it.
That's an interesting process.
Yeah. So that was kind of fun, combining all these different processes together.
How long ago did you make these pieces?
These are from like 2016, so
Ooh.
2 years ago. This one is sitting next to me on a different pedestal right now. But I was at home. Well, this piece I made in grad school and added the embellishment of flock later on. And this piece I made at home. Well, I made this at the workshop, and the other pieces I made at home.
So, you know, that flocks there reminded me of, you know, do you know Anish Kapoor?
Yes.
He goes from the most matte surfaces that you could possibly think about to the most reflective surfaces that you could possibly think about. And it's all about, you know, his surfaces being so varied. Go ahead.
Okay. So like around 2017, I applied to be a resident artist at the Museum of Arts and Design. And their program, they allow, I think it's 6 artists for the week. Everyone gets 1 day of the week, and you travel to MAD and you share a studio space. You get the one space to yourself, and then next door to you is a fellow who gets their space like every day, and they get a stipend, and it's beautiful. I think they make like, I don't know, I think it was like $10,000 when I was there. The fellow artists got. They had to be like under a certain age and living in New York City. I wasn't living in New York City, so I couldn't apply for that. But I applied to be a resident artist, and you didn't have to be from New York City. Like the year that I was there was a guy, Adam Ledford, who was traveling from Philadelphia 1 day a week to be at MAD. But basically you work in a fishbowl because it's completely all glass walls. And you get to make your work and interact with people from all over the world because there's constantly people from all over the world coming into MAD. So at the time I was making things that like I didn't think were pieces, and I put them on my wall in my home studio. And I kind of just fell in love with this idea of making these things that weren't necessarily meant to be like their own sculpture, but like were ideas or kind of like a mood board of ceramics. And through this opportunity at MAD, I was thinking more about accessibility to art and how I could, you know, get people to see my work more. And I started, I'm just going to pop over to this first and I'll go back. I started making pieces that I then left places. And I would kind of document like if people came by to see it or if they didn't come by to see it. And what I was doing in the city was I was kind of embedding them in public places like the subway station, or they had this thing called the Turnstile in Columbus Circle, which is like a mini mall in the subway. And they had like these picnic tables where people could eat. So I would like set up pieces like this on the picnic table and then like watch people interact with the work. And I left a note being like, take me home with you and like, you know, put me up on your social with like hashtag whatever. And like, no one ever did it. And it didn't bother me that they didn't do it. It would have been cool if it showed up, but like, it wasn't a big deal. And I started doing these on Long Island, up from the studio in East Meadow. I drove up 107 and I would drop things off and take pictures and like, kind of just like leave notes for people. On a few occasions I got some messages back, but not always. So, but from this experience at MAD, one of the big deals about being a fellow was that you get a solo show. And I always wish that they had like looked into their residents for shows. And I had made so much work like this. while I was there that they actually showed my work in the museum for 3 months on the 6th floor using their vitrines that they had up there. And that was like a great experience. And then recently last year, they came to me and they said, hey, like, you know, we have a show coming up and we really think that, you know, you might be a great visual on the 6th floor. And since you have so much work, and we wanted to know if we could come to your studio and check it out. And I was like, yeah, sure, totally. So it was like the opportunity to potentially show. And I kind of had this like almost, you know, it was a studio visit, but it was kind of like an audition practically to get this other show that they were offering as a solo at MAD, which was like a dream of mine. And it worked out. So this piece here I made at MAD while I was there. I also made this piece at MAD. And the rest of them kind of came from ideas while I was at MAD. You had access to their collections while you were there. You had access to their people. I was in the city once a week, so I also went to museums on like lunch breaks and checked out other things. And I really kind of just enjoyed the full access to Manhattan as an artist, which doesn't always happen. But if you have the chance to apply to MAD for the resident artists opportunities, I think it's called the Artist Studios at MAD. They're really great. They also take care of their alumni. They hosted a workshop on taxes like before the pandemic hit. They've hosted just a lot of different information, and they always find ways to do new things with their previous residents.
So what does the MAD stand for?
Museum of Arts and Design.
Okay.
So they're in Columbus Circle, which I think was one of the prettiest studios I've ever had. It was like looking out across, you know, Columbus Circle from the 6th floor of MAD.
Now that's a fairly new location for them. I think
they've only been there for like less than a decade, maybe.
Yeah, because I had taught
somewhere else before that.
Yeah, I had taught there at the New York Tech campus, which was around the corner, and it was just being constructed at that point.
Yeah. The piece on the left was also made while I was on residency there. And from there, I had found out about, you know, like really trying to push to get grants and things like that. They had like a workshop on grant writing, and I took the opportunity to write for a grant through the Huntington Arts Council for coral conservation. And I had gotten the grant, so I partnered up with the Oyster Bay Historical Society and kind of worked on the work that was involving like the bleaching of coral. And I guess like through being at MAD, I was interested in decorative art and kind of exploring that. So the piece on the right is a piece that I was able to make thanks to the grant that I received through the Huntington Arts Council for a decentralization grant as an individual artist. So
I like the rhythm in that piece that goes back and forth between the hand thrown pieces and your organic pieces. It goes kind of alternates back and forth. I like that.
Thanks. Yeah, and I also had opportunities to kind of play with it, like Glaze Chemistry idea of like, you know, low fire and glaze and things like that, to that respect. And then more recently, I got asked, well, I applied for Claytopia New York, which was curated by Matt Nolan, but he got to pick a few more artists from a group that applied to bring their work to the Plaxar Gallery. So this was kind of really great for me, getting to install this work in another setting. So Constructing Awkward Beauty has always been installed in segments or as the whole form. And this piece has grown over the years. I had shown it with the Patchwork Arts Council when I had come back from grad school. And that is still the biggest that I've had it. I think that was 8 by 9 feet. And I remember walking in and John had all these like pedestals set up. And I like didn't know what to do. And you were just like, go for it. And it worked out. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the image that I had of that. It was on my other hard drive.
We're hoping that Beth can find it. She's back there somewhere.
Yeah.
She
so
gave
the piece
up
is like grown in some respects. Sorry, guys. It's a really old laptop and I keep changing my password.
So the Constructing Awkward Beauty is a piece that in every installation has a different form.
Different forms. Some things I like and I keep, and I try to rebox it that way or pack it up that way because some forms are separate, some are together. Like this piece here is one whole piece that I had glazed together. This is one whole piece that's glazed together. You can kind of see Softer Skin is tucked in over here.
Mm-hmm.
So like I'm constantly building up on ideas, and some things get removed and some things get added. There were no like temperature lights, but if there had been, this piece would have changed color. I recently found out about moody paint, which changes colors in heat. So sometimes when it's exceedingly hot in the summer, that's completely purple, and I kind of loved that idea. And then I went to Italy like 2 years ago, but this is kind of relevant to like the work that I'm working on now. I had taken all these images at the Boboli Gardens and at all these other shrines that I had seen throughout Rome
It's
and
8
Florence.
o'clock.
And I really just kind of enjoyed the architectural ideas that were going on in these pieces. So when I was in Rome, I did these coral drops similar to what I was doing in Manhattan, but I would scout out these other areas and insert my corals into their space. And this just felt like perfect.
So when I first looked at this, I was looking for, what is your sculpture? And then I saw this like embedded shingle material, and I was saying, that's kind of different. And then I looked a little bit more closely.
This is actually around the corner from a supermarket, and I like stumbled upon it by accident. It happened to be like across the street from where I was staying. And I just felt like it was like a niche that was meant for me to find.
Was this Rome?
Yes.
Yes, Rome. It says it right there, right? Yeah.
And then in the inside the Jewish ghetto, that's what they call it, or the Jewish square, I guess. They have like these older walls, and I had studied the walls and taken pictures, and throughout the time there was never anything stuck in that one space. So my last week of being in Rome, I had kind of ventured out and kind of added my work into their natural landscape, which is what I wanted to do while I was there.
That's great. That's great. So that wall is probably about 2,000 years old.
Right. And then there's something that's like a whole week old put in there. And none of those things lasted very long. Like I would hang out in the area, and like probably within like a half hour, these things would be taken. And I was always curious, like, what did people do with it? I had a guy once who found a piece up in Oyster Bay, and he like managed to contact me through the note and was like, hey, I put it in my fish tank. And I was like, hey, it's glazed. You should remove it. Like, when you glaze things, not all glazes are fish friendly. And it was like something that had like iron oxide and something else in it, which definitely would have killed his fish. And he was like, oh, thanks for letting me know. And I've been asked before if I've thought about putting my work in a fish tank. And the reality is like, I never really thought about it that way, like as a literal coral. But while we were at RISD, they have a nature lab, which is really a beautiful space full of taxidermy, skeletons, like former parts of different animals. But they have an aquarium space where they were keeping some fish. And if you bisque porcelain, you can use that in a fish tank, and it'll actually help to grow like natural, not necessarily corals, but other like sea plants on top of it. It's good for that kind of a breeding ground.
So that Bisque
from the Nature Center used to come in and say, hey, like, is there anything that hasn't been taken or like, claimed, could we use it? And we would give them like our leftover, parts of things.
Right. So the Bisque porcelain would not be vitrified. So it had pores in it still.
Yeah, which will allow for that kind of like sea
growth to happen.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people out there that are using like terracotta and spraying buttermilk, moss on them, and like regenerating almost like a chia pet kind of effect.
What about that place off the coast of Mexico where all of the sculptures are submerged?
Right, they're submerged. They're cement, and they're submerged in.
They're cement, yeah.
I believe they're cement. And they've been submerged in the ocean. They've been taken over by corals. I thought that was really.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We'd have to find that.
These are some newer forms from within the last year. The one on the left, I actually embedded a form here, and this is from a friend who's a ceramicist named Brett Wallerstein. We met at a workshop like almost a decade ago, and we've kept in touch. And before the pandemic hit, I had reached out to him and was like, do you have anything that like, didn't work out, or that like I could, put in my work? Because I really love like the conversation that our work has together, because he's also working with similar ideas about marine life. And he said, sure. So he sent me a whole box of some older forms of his. And I said, can I like, is it okay for me to kind of attack them with color? And he was like, go for it. His work is usually stark white. kind of like created this other conversation between our works and having kind of a semi-collaborative environment. And I'm going to be sending him some bisqued porcelain corals to add to his arrangements. And we're kind of starting this other kind of conversation, which is amazing because right now during quarantine, it's been really rough as an artist to not connect to other people. And I think that was like another reason I was really drawn to the Patchogue Arts Council's like crit nights, because you kind of got to meet other artists and we're all stuck at home. And we're able to kind of share our work on a different platform and get different perspectives from so many different types of artists, whether they're just starting out or they've been like in the thick of it for a while. So, and then the piece on the right is, I don't know, I've been playing with glazes a lot, and I sometimes end up with like these kind of strange groupings of color. And I think I'm thinking about painting again, but you know, painting a pot, or painting a vessel, and thinking about corals and kind of, I guess, redefining what that means for me, which lately has been kind of, I don't know, I've been reading about Jackson Pollock's autobiography, and maybe I just had a spur of the moment painting night. And then recently I've been making these other forms and taking them outside with me. And
so that's a singular unity of piece, right? Except for
right.
the
And I kind of feel like these now have like this life outside, or they could have this life outside. And there's so many different beautiful colors in this that you could see in a plant. So it's not so weird to see it in nature, because there's a lot of these colors found in nature.
You'd have to take it in the winter.
Yeah, I mean, I do. And I've thought about like, other people have been asking me lately, you know, like, are you happy with this image just being an artwork as it is? Or do you feel like you would have to recreate that kind of scenery for the piece to be seen in a gallery? Or would you be cool with that piece being on a white pedestal in a gallery? And I don't know if I'd feel the same amount of excitement not being able to like experience the piece as a piece if it were just an image. But I think that's an interesting conversation to have. Like, I'm not done saying like, oh, it can only be seen like in person, but I don't know how I feel about that. That's been a question that I guess I'm grappling with. But do you feel like your work, could you be happy with your work just as a photograph, or do you feel like your work
I don't know. I put one up today that we saw, but they're fun to look at. But the experience of the work is so much more than just like this singular view, right? So your piece, the one we were just looking at, you could go around it and see it from different ways and watch different relationships unfold that you can't if it's just a picture.
Right.
Right. So that's why sculptors make sculpture, for
right.
all of
I mean, that's why,
that richness of view. Yeah.
Within the realm. Yeah. And then I wanted to just share some other artists that like I'm constantly thinking about. And I think since I've been getting bigger in my work, I'm thinking about Viola Frey, who made these huge people sculptures, or sculptures of people, and then would glaze them and paint them. I don't think I would go into figurative work, but I definitely find her work really inspiring. And
she works in pieces, yes, right.
Yeah, she works in pieces, which was like another thing for me to think about. Betty Woodman's been like, I don't know, my ceramic shiro for a very, very long time. She was like one of the first artists that I ever looked up for like a ceramic project. And I really loved how her work involved the 2D realm and the 3D realm, and kind of creating like a whole entirety of an experience. And some of her other work, she's got paintings behind her pots, or her pieces are like really site specific. And there's a lot of conversations between the patterns in her pots and things like that. And she lived in Tuscany for most of the year. And I think she came back to New York for some months at a time.
She was in the middle third of the 20th century, right?
Yeah, and she was one of the most like influential female ceramicists, as well as Viola Frey in the realm. So lately I've been, I think, kind of repositioning my work. I was really grateful to you guys to let me photograph my work in the space yesterday, because it's just hectic where I am. And I've been wanting to photograph my work on grass. So this is fake grass that I ordered off Amazon. But I really my studio is surrounded by greenery. My parents live next door to a sump. So we've got this like overgrowing greenery, and then their whole backyard's green. And I feel like I wanted my work to be on the grass, like where I've grown up. So, and this piece I'm also kind of exploring with those like over fire glazes, and I could get into all the technicalities of it, but I was really just focused on like blues and adding some highlights and using some platinum and kind of finding a different way of having that conversation with coral or just the idea of a bush. So, and then lastly, this is kind of like a curveball, but I always thought about these jars at the Met and how they would hold like your remains or certain things that you need in the afterlife. And not to say that I believe in an afterlife or I don't believe in an afterlife, but I've had this pot in my studio for such a long time, and I kind of started exploring surfaces, and like this has been probably fired a few times, and I've broken down a former sculpture to get the lid, and then I had a coral, and I thought about if I had a tomb later on in life, afterlife, maybe I would want some type of seedling of a coral to be able to be with me in the afterlife. So I was thinking about
so you know about reliquaries.
I think that might
right?
be. I think that's definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely just like we're in quarantine and like you have no idea what's gonna happen. I think like hit all of us differently. I also started adding nail polish to the surfaces of my clay, so the green in there and the sparkles here were kind of me breaking the rules again of my own rules in clay and kind of adding that other kind of resin adhesive or hardener. So there's that guy again. And then I was just gonna invite everybody to a demo that I'm hosting through the Clay Art Center. It's totally free, you just have to register online. And I'll be demoing the stuff that I've shared with you guys today and kind of talking about like the whole process of it from start to finish. In I think it's an hour, but mainly it'll just be like me demoing the making of the work.
So I would normally ask, where is this place? But it's home.
Yeah.
Everybody's home.
All up in here.
So you'll be doing the demo, and we'll be watching. Yeah.
I mean, I'm lucky. I understand how lucky I am, or I've realized how lucky I am over the last few weeks to have access to a studio. I know that this must be like incredibly hard for people that can't have access to their studios. I'm one of those people that like needs to make, or I'm not in a healthy headspace. I just like making has been that thing for me to like move through like all the tough parts of my life and just to move through all the good parts of my life.
Yeah, I have to admit to being lucky too with the studio, and as a matter of fact, almost every day at this time of the day, you would find me in my studio.
Right.
Anybody's welcome to stop by and chat for a little bit, except for this day because I'm here.
Yeah.
It's a solace to have a workspace that you can go to and
right.
and it's sort of like like it's a tough time for us all, but for me anyway, I'm almost gifted in the fact that I have less distractions in my life now, and I am spending more time in my studio. 3 to 4 hours every day is a lot.
And it's also like I'd be in the studio at this time of day anyway because my daughter goes down to sleep at like 7, so it's like the perfect time to get like 3 or 4 hours in before bed. But if anyone needs help with like firing work, I have a kiln and it works, and I'm happy to do some weird.
He has a kiln if you have clay.
Need stuff fired, just hit me up. Happy to fire. Or if you need to borrow a wheel for a few days, we got that too. So
I might want to take you up on that someday.
You gotta I don't know. I feel like at a time like this, you gotta share. We all have to share.
The thing about the wheel is like you need to be able to get your mindset into throwing, which is like a whole nother
realm.
way of being in the world, and it's like you have to be settled for it, because like I'm at Nassau, and there's oftentimes when there's wheels all over the place and I have hours of free time, but I can't psychologically turn away from like the teaching and all of that and just sit there and focus at like all that focus on the wheel.
Definitely a meditation.
Yeah, it's
And
a
it's
great
hard
one. It's
sometimes.
really a
And
great meditation.
it's tough sometimes teaching that too, because I've been on the other end of it teaching students, at St. Joseph's. I taught a class a while back, and it's hard for them to get out of where they're at. It's hard to put the phone down. It's hard to exit whatever's going on in your life sometimes. Sometimes you can't mentally be there. And for clay, you have to be able to like take a breath. And I had one kid who was ROTC, and I will never forget this night because it was just, there's like a secret Potter in every class. I'm a firm believer in it, because I've seen it happen. But this kid was ROTC. He was like not initially like, he was like, oh, this would be an easy A. And I was trying to explain that like, this is a process-oriented medium. And if you can't put the time in, you shouldn't be here. And I wasn't trying to be rude about it. It's just, that's the way it is. Because when something doesn't work out, you redo it and you redo it and you redo it until you've got it down. So I had offered my students that I would come in a few Friday nights to like help them out, because I just feel like, I think it was like an hour and a half class for clay. And that's not enough time. No offense to anyone. It's not enough time. You could knead your clay and have 2 pieces before it's horrible. So I offered to come in. So this kid, I had one kid and he said he was going to come and I thought he wasn't going to come. And I show up and he's already on the wheel with like a 1-foot cylinder and he's ecstatic and I'm ecstatic because I'm watching him get it. And he's like, this is amazing. I'm going to be here every day. I can be here. That's great. And he made beautiful work. And he said it was a great space because after all the ROT training that he had and all the stress from like regular life, he felt like he could come to the wheel and make something and feel fulfilled by it because it kind of had that instant gratification because he knew he was good at it. And then, you push them a little bit and they get a little, uncomfortable, I guess. But then, it was, I was so happy that he had found something that he could put his, put everything aside for. I think that's hard these days because people just want the gratification of Facebook or of Instagram to know that they're like, quote unquote, liked. But sometimes it's harder than that, not about that all the time.
Yeah, so it's good to find that practice in something.
Right.
Yeah. And if you haven't ever experienced, throwing, I recommend you find a place where you can take a class in it. It's really a great experience. I loved throwing.
Too.
Yeah.
They were popping up.
What I didn't love was handles. It's like handles were my bane of my existence. Handles.
I was watching someone recently. I think we were talking about this before, but Lisa Orr makes. She's also the queen of low fire. She makes handles. She's made I think it's a plaster or no, it's a sprig mold. So she carved clay, fired it, so it's bisque fired, and then she imprints another strip of clay and pulls up a handle. And I thought that was kind of a cool way of like getting over that hump.
Yeah, for working with clay, it's different than other materials in that like it has a different moisture content for different processes you're working on, and you have to always be aware of how moist your clay is, how wet it is, how flexible it is, what you could do with it in different states. It's really like you have to nurse your clay when you're
you have to be on top of your clay.
Yeah.
I think the smartest thing I learned about was Molly Hatch, who's a product ceramicist or production ceramicist. She was teaching a workshop she was teaching a class at RISD on tableware, and the first thing they did the first day was make a damp box, which is basically a plastic box with a lid. And you pour plaster about 2 or 3 inches up the piece and you let it sit there. And you create something that you can pop out of the box later and like work with your clay, and later on put it back in the box and be able to put your tableware pieces, your cups, your mugs, and put you could wrap them or not wrap them. But when you put the lid back on them, it basically creates like a greenhouse for the work, so that, you're still on top of it. You know that you have to keep on top of it, but it can keep things a lot way more moist than if you had just wrapped them and put them on a shelf. So I took up that kind of practice in my studio here, because sometimes you end up with reclaim, and I'm sometimes nervous that I'm going to leave it in the studio without wrapping it properly. And if I throw it into this like box with the plaster soaks up the moisture. So by the next day I can re-wedge perfectly. Or I can put a piece in there and not worry about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Yes, it's
definitely, it's process oriented, and I think a lot of people don't always think about that. So.
Takes a special person to work with ceramics. I've always felt like, you know, we were talking before about, you said that I was telling you about how to, you know, that you couldn't get materials to do things that they're not supposed to do. And that was pretty much my whole aim of working in ceramics, was to get clay to do what it didn't normally do. So I was carving it into these surfaces, these pieces that were really fine, but in some places they're, you know, they had to dry so you could do the detail, and then they were brittle and they weighed a lot, and then you would take them to the kiln, and it was like half of them didn't survive, and I would have to start with 75 pounds, and I would end up with like this, you know, this thing that was,
or it shrinks down.
Yeah, it shrinks down, and you get hardly anything with it. And it was like, finally I said, let me try another material, and that's when I started working with wood.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people don't like the unexpectedness of clay, but I find it like intriguing, and I feel like it just, you know, some people like, they know the specific clay body they use, and they know that the glaze fit's going to be like spot on, and they have to know those things because those are things that they need for their work to excel and soar. And for me, it's like, if something doesn't quite work out, I usually fire it again and again and again until I get what I want. And sometimes I fire something just because I like want one thing to do something differently in one specific area, and I know it's not really going to affect the rest of the piece, you know?
That
it comes down to like science of it,
right.
And then there's also a little bit of like uncertainty, but it's, I don't know. I feel like I'm always learning something new, and I think that's what keeps me drawn to it.
A lot of times people ask me, like, do you see your piece before you start in the block? And I usually say, you know, I have an idea of what it's going to look like, but I'm not really, you know, I couldn't map it out exactly what it's going to be. And I get that sense with you too. It's like, you know, you have an idea in your head, but it's never going to be like 100% like in advance before you do it.
Right. I mean, like, the other thing is, like, I think people are always like, oh, do you make everything, you know, like, is your work like you're making something specific? And I think a lot of the time, like, there are a lot of people out there that make something, they're goal oriented. And for me, I'm making a lot of parts constantly. And then I feel like it's like real life Jenga in the studio, because I'm like hand stacking things until I find something I like. And then I'm like working basically backwards, you know, to like get there. And sometimes like I have an idea and I'm working through that idea, and I've done it a bunch of different times with different things, you know. But I feel like a lot of the time for me, it's kind of like, all right, I've been thinking about this formation for 3 weeks. Like, let's make this stick. You know?
How is it? Right.
How is that gonna work? And sometimes, like lately, I am, you know, at a certain point, I'm like, all right, if I fire this one more time, it's not necessarily gonna stick. But if I use like epoxy, it's going to get me there, and I can make it, you know, look like I didn't use epoxy. But it doesn't bother me so much having to use like a resin or a hardener to do that, you know. If it's
Yes.
get me
I've started using 5-minute epoxy myself, you know, and you know, in the pieces that I've made that have come from logs as opposed to kiln dried wood, there's always checking that goes on, like this opening up that happens. And I've started using 5-minute epoxy mixed with different sawdust. So now I'm actually having I have like all of these different jars of colored sawdust that each wood produces. And yeah, it's kind of an interesting, just a reintroduction of a color into my work.
Yeah. Beth Kavanaugh Stitcher makes these beautiful animal sculptures, and she started at the Bray, which is like a really big residency to get. And she said that like when things started inevitably ceramics cracks, she found a way of using, apparently the Bray makes this special kind of epoxy, but you can mix it with colorants or with like house paint. And she was using house paint to paint some of her pieces. So she had found a way to basically like make the colorant and add it to the epoxy and be able to kind of use it almost like complete. It's not. There's another epoxy that's like white that's full, like moldable. I forget the exact. Is it Complete Sculptor? No, that's a sculpture store. Magic Sculpt.
Right, we
kind
were
of
talking
like
about
that.
that.
You could mix it into that kind of a thing and then apply it to ceramics, and it wouldn't look like it wouldn't shrink as much after it's adhered. So it'd make everything look flawless. But I haven't felt a need for that yet. Because I feel like I'm okay with some cracks here and there. And I feel like there's like the kintsugi where you like plug in gold to highlight the cracks.
Right.
You know, it's like a Japanese tradition.
Right,
I feel like
and
I've been doing that with colorants lately.
People have been using the like blue pigmented resin, and they put it in the wood, so
to make the table look like it's flowing,
Yeah, right. So I've been asked a lot about that, but you have to have a flat surface to pour. To pour in. But I didn't want to use blue because blue isn't really a color that you find in wood. So I was happy to come upon the idea of using these sawdust, and some of them are so deep red, and the colors of the sawdust that I have are really fascinating. So it's interesting, but.
Well, thank you for having me tonight, John. It's been
well,
fun.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. It was good to see your work over time. For those of you who might not have followed from the beginning, I had the chance to meet Lauren before she went to graduate school, and she was a student of mine. And I always learn from my students as much as I hope they learn from me. So it was always fun to work with Lauren. And then one day on Facebook, I saw what she was doing in graduate school. And I said, wow, I want to show that. When you get to be a curator, you get to pick what you show. And what Lauren was doing was like really fascinating. So so I'm happy to be able to continue working with you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, that was one of the top moments coming home, being able to show and patchog and kind of see you and kind of see how things changed. And you challenged me with those pedestals. It was like 8 different pedestals that did not belong together. And I felt like I cracked the code after getting it after a few hours. I think I bought like 16 boxes of corals, and you're like, all that? And I'm like, yeah, we're going to make it work. And we did.
Yeah, we did. It flowed from one pedestal to another, and it really worked.
It was real life Jenga, and it was good.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this for us, Lauren.
Thanks. You guys have been really great, generous with your space and generous with your time and your platforms, and I really appreciate that.
Wonderful. Yes. We like to work with artists. We like to, in some ways challenge artists when we can, because that's how we all grow. I guess that's a teacher, and it's both Beth and I are teachers as well as artists, so
definitely. And you guys have a really great crit group, so if anyone has time coming up and they want to present, you definitely should check out their packed crit night, because it's such a great online community during this crazy time to be able to like connect with other people.